There comes a time in history when a single voice rises above the noise of oppression, a voice that doesn't shout for power but whispers for peace. In the heart of America, when injustice ruled like a tyrant and fear walked openly in the streets, a young man stood with nothing but his faith, his courage, and his words. He was not born into royalty, yet he became a king who ruled not through armies, but through the strength of his soul. This is not a tale of crowns or castles. This is the story of a man who built his empire in the hearts of people, a man who proved that even when the world breaks you, faith can rebuild you stronger than before. He was born into a world where equality was still a dream whispered in silence. The air around him carried the weight of centuries of division, the heavy chains of injustice that had mocked his ancestors. But even as a child, he was taught that there is no chain stronger than faith, and no darkness that light cannot break. His father was a preacher, a man of words and wisdom, who reminded him that dignity is not granted by men but given by the Creator. In that small home filled with prayer and hope, his spirit began to grow like a flame waiting for purpose. He watched as the world outside moved with cruelty disguised as order. Signs that divided people by color were placed everywhere in schools, buses, and even water fountains. But deep within his young heart, he knew that such divisions were lies created by fear. He learned early that every soul is created equal, and that true power lies not in how loud a man can shout, but in how firm he stands for truth. Every insult he witnessed became a lesson, every injustice a test of his patience. When he heard his father speak from the pulpit, he saw that words could heal or destroy. That realization settled inside him like destiny itself. He understood that words could move mountains, that the tongue could be sharper than any blade when guided by truth. And so, even as a boy, he began to imagine a life where speech would be his weapon and justice his battlefield. He was not born into luxury or power, but he was born into purpose, and that was greater than any crown. His mother would tell him stories of faith, of those who suffered with patience and rose through steadfastness. These stories became his foundation. He began to see that strength was not always in striking back, but in standing firm. When others shouted in anger, he learned to respond with calm. When others bowed to fear, he learned to kneel only before his Lord. This discipline of spirit would later become the armor that protected him through every trial. As he grew, he noticed that most people accepted the world as it was, even when it was unjust. But something within him refused to stay silent. He could not walk past wrong and pretend it was normal. His conscience became a fire that could not be contained. He started to speak in classrooms, in small gatherings, and his words, though young, carried weight. People saw in him a reflection of something greater, a reminder that courage can exist even in the smallest voice. In those early days, the idea of challenging injustice seemed impossible. The system was vast, the powers strong, and the price of resistance high. But he believed that no system built on wrong could stand forever. He began to understand that every great change begins with one person willing to stand alone. That realization was the seed of his destiny, the understanding that true leadership starts when one man decides that silence is no longer an option. He studied deeply, not only the history of his people, but the history of mankind. He searched for truth in the words of scholars and prophets who came before him. What he found was a pattern that every era produced men who stood between fear and faith and chose faith. He wanted to be among them, to stand as one who would lift the weight of oppression, not through force, but through principle. The more he learned, the more his heart aligned with his mission. Each lesson he absorbed became became a part of his armor. Education gave him knowledge, faith gave him direction, and experience gave him resilience. He did not see knowledge as pride, but as a trust, something to be used for the service of others. His understanding of right and wrong was shaped not by the laws of men, but by the higher law of justice that governs every soul. And as his understanding grew, so did his courage. By the time he reached manhood, his voice had gained the strength of conviction. People listened not because he demanded attention, but because truth resonates naturally. His speech carried calm authority, the kind that silences noise without raising volume. He knew he had been prepared for something larger than himself. The struggles he witnessed as a boy were now guiding him to become the voice for those who could not speak. And so, in the stillness of his early life, the foundations of greatness were laid. He had seen injustice, but he had also seen faith. He had tasted oppression, but he had also tasted hope. These two forces, pain and belief, would become the twin fires that forged his path. Before the world would know his name, before his speeches would echo through history, his spirit was already being shaped into a weapon of peace. When he first stepped into leadership, the world was watching, though few understood what kind of man he truly was. Many expected him to lead with anger, to fight oppression with the same force that had built it, but his heart refused that path. He had studied too long, prayed too deeply, and learned too well that darkness cannot drive out darkness. He believed that the real test of power was not in conquering enemies, but in conquering oneself. So when people came to him crying for revenge, he offered them a different vision, one where justice would rise without hatred, and victory would come without blood. He told them that their cause was not a struggle between races, but between right and wrong. His words cut through confusion like a sword made of truth. He said, "We must not become what we are fighting against." And those who listened began to understand. They began to see that their movement was not just for equality, but for the soul of their nation. His leadership turned frustration into discipline and despair into direction. He gave people not only something to fight against, but something to fight for. His message was tested immediately. Opponents mocked him, calling his path of peace a sign of weakness. They could not comprehend that restraint is often the highest form of strength. But he did not falter. He stood firm before his followers and reminded them that patience is not surrender. It is the shield of the righteous, the armor of those who know that time, truth, and faith are on their side. And while others screamed for instant victory, he worked for lasting change. He taught his followers that their mission was not to destroy, but to transform. If we strike our enemy with hate, he said, we have already lost. He wanted them to fight a battle that would end not when their opponents were crushed, but when their hearts were opened. That was the essence of his philosophy, to turn conflict into compassion and resistance into reform. His belief in peaceful strength made his movement more powerful than any weapon, because it awakened conscience in those who once remained silent. Many who joined him were weary, broken by years of injustice, yet his presence revived their spirits. He gave them purpose and dignity. He reminded them that they were not victims, but vessels of change. Through his words, people who had felt invisible began to see their worth again. He told them that the Creator does not measure greatness by wealth or color, but by character. That truth became the foundation of their unity, and the world began to notice. He walked through streets filled with tension, knowing that at any moment, violence could erupt. Yet he moved with calm, as if guarded by something unseen. His courage came not from arrogance, but from faith. Each step he took carried a message that fear only grows when you feed it. and peace only wins when you protect it. When crowds gathered to hear him speak, they did not just see a man. They saw a movement in motion, a living example of what conviction looks like. There were moments when even his followers doubted him. They wanted to answer cruelty with defiance, to shout when they were silenced. But he would lift his hand and the crowd would quiet. He would speak softly, reminding them that they were chosen not for revenge, but for righteousness. His calmness disarmed fury, and his humility drew respect even from enemies. Slowly, the world began to understand that this was not a struggle of rebellion, but of renewal. When he preached about love, he did not mean weakness. His love was discipline. It was the kind that forgives but does not forget the mission. It was the kind that stands in front of injustice and says, "I will not hate you, but I will not obey your wrong." He wanted to build an empire of hearts, not thrones. For him, love was a form of resistance, a refusal to let hate dictate the terms of battle. That philosophy became the core of his movement and the key to its strength. As his voice spread across the nation, it began to soften even the hardest hearts. Some who once opposed him began to question their own beliefs. They could not understand how a man under such constant threat could remain so composed, so steadfast. But that was the power of his method. It was not meant to destroy enemies, but to reveal the truth within them. His nonviolent approach became not only a moral choice, but a strategic one, disarming opponents without raising a single weapon. In a world where many sought power through control, he sought it through conscience. His vision was not of a kingdom built on submission, but of a community built on respect. He knew that laws could change the surface of society, but only truth could change the heart of a nation. His leadership was not about commanding obedience. It was about awakening responsibility. Through him, people learned that true victory is not in defeating others, but in defeating the injustice within ourselves. The Montgomery bus protest was the spark that turned faith into movement and conviction into power. It began with one woman's quiet defiance, a refusal to surrender her dignity. When she stayed seated, the world took notice. But it was he who transformed that single act into a movement that would shake the system from its roots. He saw in that moment not just an incident but a sign, that the time had come to stand without striking, to speak without shouting, to fight without hate. It was here that his leadership met its first true test, and he passed it with the patience of a believer and the wisdom of a thinker. The city of Montgomery became the stage for a new kind of war, one fought not with weapons but with willpower. The rule was simple: do not ride the buses that deny your worth. Day after day, men and women walked miles to work, to school, to worship, refusing to give in to humiliation. Each step they took was an act of resistance, each stride a declaration that they would rather walk in dignity than ride in shame. He led them not with threats, but with guidance, reminding them that every sacrifice made for truth brings victory closer. For over a year, they marched through rain, through exhaustion, through threats, yet their spirits did not break. They were harassed, their homes attacked, but their discipline did not fade. It was not easy. There were moments of despair, of weariness, of doubt, but his words became the rope that held them together. He told them that real power is not in how loud you protest, but in how long you persist, and persist they did. The movement became a mirror reflecting the strength of faith-driven endurance. He spoke to them every evening, reminding them that peace was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. He urged them to hold fast, not to let anger poison their cause. If we lose our patience, he would say, we lose our power. These words echoed in their hearts as they faced every new hardship. Slowly, the nation began to see something extraordinary. People changing the world not through violence, but through unity rooted in principle. The enemies of justice tried to crush their will. They sent threats, they spread lies, they hoped to divide the movement from within. Yet his calm became their strength. His voice, steady as the morning, told them that the Creator stands with those who stand for truth. And that reminder alone was enough to keep them walking. He turned their pain into purpose, their struggle into story. The Montgomery protests stopped being a local act. It became a symbol of human dignity rising against oppression. His leadership was not about command, but about character. He did not demand obedience, he inspired it. People followed him not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. He carried himself with humility, spoke with compassion, and lived what he preached. Even those who disagreed with him could not deny his sincerity. The world began to see that something divine was happening in Montgomery, an awakening that could not be reversed. When the boycott stretched into months, many began to worry. Food was scarce, shoes were worn thin, and energy was fading. But he reminded them that every great change demands a price. We are walking, he said, so that one day our children can run free. Those words gave new life to weary feet and tired hearts. Each morning, as people left their homes to walk, they carried his faith with them like a torch lighting their way. Eventually, the movement began to bear fruit. The law that had once divided people on buses began to crumble under the weight of moral truth. The courts ruled that segregation on public transport was unjust. The day the decision was announced, he did not celebrate with pride, but with gratitude. He reminded everyone that victory belongs not to those who boast, but to those who believe. That moment was more than a legal triumph. It was the birth of a new chapter in the struggle for justice. News of their success spread beyond Montgomery, reaching hearts across the nation and even the world. People began to see that peace could be more powerful than violence, that unity could be stronger than hate. His name became known not because he sought fame, but because truth naturally shines where darkness falls. He had proven that faith, patience, and discipline could rewrite history, that a man guided by principle could move mountains without raising a sword. But even in victory, he did not rest. He knew this was only the beginning. The Montgomery protest had awakened something in the soul of the nation, a realization that injustice could be defeated through persistence and moral strength. He looked at the people, tired but triumphant, and said, "This is not the end of the journey. This is the first step." In that moment, the King of Justice had shown the world that true power does not come from fear, but from faith that never bends. After the Montgomery victory, his journey entered a new and more dangerous stage. The system he challenged was not ready to surrender easily. It fought back with arrests, threats, and endless attempts to silence him. But his heart was not moved by fear, because he knew that truth must walk through trials before it reaches triumph. Every time he was thrown into a cell, he emerged stronger, with his faith refined and his voice sharper. What others called punishment, he saw as preparation. He understood that greatness is never born in comfort, it is forged in struggle. The walls of the jail could not contain the voice of a man who spoke for millions. Even behind bars, he wrote words that would echo across generations. His letters were not of anger, but of awakening. He reminded his followers that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Those words became a rallying cry for all who believed in righteousness. The very chains meant to silence him ended up amplifying his message. They tried to humiliate him, but he turned humiliation into honor. Every attempt to weaken his resolve only exposed the weakness of his enemies. The more they attacked him, the more people began to see that he was fighting not for himself, but for everyone who had been denied dignity. He faced hate with patience, oppression with discipline, and violence with peace. That contrast became his power. Where others would have broken down, he stood tall, proving that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in restraint guided by purpose. He began to travel across cities carrying the same message that had shaken Montgomery. His speeches were not merely words, they were fire wrapped in faith. When he spoke, crowds didn't just listen, they believed. He painted a vision of a world where character mattered more than color, where unity would triumph over division. People began to see in him a living example of courage guided by conscience. He was not just a leader, he had become a mirror reflecting what humanity could be when guided by truth. But his rise brought more danger. There were those who wanted him gone, who feared what his influence could do. He received death threats daily. His family lived under constant fear, yet he never let that fear dictate his steps. He would say, "If you live for truth, you cannot die in vain." He understood that his mission was bigger than his life. Every time he stepped on stage, he knew it might be his last, but he still spoke with the calm of a man who trusted his Creator completely. There were moments when his closest followers doubted the path. Some wanted to meet aggression with aggression, but he reminded them that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. He knew that peace was not weakness, it was divine discipline. It takes far greater power to forgive than to fight, and through his patience he began to change not only laws but hearts. The world started to see that justice built on faith stands taller than empires built on fear. His leadership began to move beyond local struggles and became a global symbol of hope. From Africa to Asia, people began to quote his words, seeing him as a voice for the oppressed everywhere. His message crossed borders because it was rooted in truth, not politics. He showed that moral courage is universal, that the quest for justice belongs to every soul that breathes. He had become not just an American figure, but a light for the entire world. The government tried to discredit him, painting him as a troublemaker. But history cannot be written by those who fear truth. He continued to march, to preach, to lead not for recognition, but for righteousness. His actions were proof that when a man walks with purpose, no power can stop him. Even those who opposed him began to feel respect for his discipline and his unwavering commitment to peace. His life became a living sermon, teaching that real leadership is not about command, but about sacrifice. He faced setbacks, betrayal, and slander, yet he never spoke with bitterness. Instead, he called for understanding, for unity, for faith in a higher justice. He often said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That belief carried him through the storms, reminding his people that patience is not weakness. It is a weapon sharpened by faith. His endurance became the proof that truth, though delayed, is never denied. By the end of this phase, the King of Justice had proven that victory is not just won on the battlefield, but within the heart. His battles were not for crowns or lands, but for conscience and equality. He turned pain into purpose, prison into platform, and resistance into revelation. His life became a testimony that even in a world full of cruelty, a man guided by faith and discipline can rise above hate not by conquering others, but by conquering himself. As his movement grew, so did the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every march, every speech, every act of defiance carried a risk, not just for him, but for thousands who followed his lead. He began to feel the pressure of being both a leader and a target. The nights were long, the threats constant, yet he refused to retreat. He understood that when you are chosen to lead a cause greater than yourself, comfort becomes a luxury you must sacrifice. His strength came not from anger, but from faith that truth, no matter how delayed, will always rise above falsehood. He knew that the true test of leadership was not in victory, but in endurance. The world praised his courage, but few saw the exhaustion behind the smile, the fear he had to master daily. Yet, each morning he would rise again, putting his mission before his emotions. He taught his people that consistency is a greater weapon than any sword. Change, he would say, does not come overnight. It comes through relentless persistence. His very life became a symbol of that persistence, a lesson that transformation begins not in crowds, but in the quiet strength of one determined soul. As he continued his struggle, his message began to evolve. It was no longer just about one group's rights. It was about the soul of humanity. He began to speak for the poor, the oppressed, the forgotten. His compassion expanded beyond boundaries. He understood that injustice is one body, and wherever it hurts, the whole world feels the pain. That realization made him a global symbol, but it also made powerful enemies. The more truth he spoke, the more those in authority felt threatened by his influence. He started addressing economic inequality, questioning systems that kept the rich richer and the poor trapped in cycles of despair. His vision went beyond color. He was now challenging the world's moral order. This shift frightened those who profited from division. They could tolerate his call for civil rights, but not his call for equality of opportunity. Yet he stood firm, knowing that if you stop speaking truth when it becomes uncomfortable, you were never truly speaking truth at all. He reminded his followers that justice is not selective. It must be whole or it is hollow. This was the stage of his journey where his courage reached its purest form. He began to face betrayal, even from within his own circles. Some believed his mission had become too broad, too risky. But he understood that a leader must walk alone at times, guided not by applause but by conviction. He continued to preach unity and peace, even as opposition grew louder. It was not popularity he sought, it was purpose. And when a man is fueled by purpose, no betrayal can break him, because his loyalty lies with truth itself. The weight of the movement began to show in his health, but not in his will. His speeches became deeper, more reflective. He spoke like a man who had seen both the darkness of humanity and the light of divine justice, and chose to keep believing in the light. His words carried the maturity of struggle, the calm of wisdom, and the certainty of faith. People didn't just hear him, they felt him. His voice had become the conscience of a generation that was learning to rise from silence to strength. He began organizing marches that symbolized not just protest, but purpose. Every step was a declaration that peace can be more powerful than violence. The roads they walked were filled with tension, but also with prayer. His leadership showed that discipline is the true mark of power. When attacked, they stood firm. When provoked, they stayed calm. It was this discipline that turned ordinary citizens into soldiers of peace. He proved that you don't need weapons to fight for justice. You need patience, courage, and unity under a righteous cause. In his later years, his vision turned toward creating an enduring legacy of empowerment. He began to speak about economic justice, about giving people not just rights, but the means to live with dignity. He wanted his people to build wealth through education, through self-reliance, through discipline. He believed that freedom without foundation is fragile. His dream was not just of equality in law, but equality in opportunity, a world where every human could stand with honor, not as a beggar of rights, but as a builder of their destiny. Despite growing danger, he never allowed fear to silence him. He was well aware that his enemies were closing in, but he walked with a peace that only comes from faith. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I've seen the promised land." Those words were not about death, they were about destiny. He knew that his mission might outlive his body, but that was enough for him. He had planted a seed in the soil of history, a seed that would keep growing long after he was gone. In the final stretch of his journey, he stood not as a man seeking survival, but as a man fulfilled by purpose. He had faced the storm and remained unshaken. His name had become a symbol of resistance rooted in righteousness. He showed the world that the mightiest kingdom is not of land or power, but of truth, patience, and unwavering faith. Through his struggle, he transformed from a preacher to a protector of humanity, and though his enemies could silence his voice, they could never silence the justice he stood for. As the years passed, his movement began to evolve beyond marches and speeches. It was no longer just a fight for freedom, it was a fight for the future. He started speaking about the deeper roots of inequality, not just in race, but in wealth, education, and opportunity. He knew that true justice could never exist if poverty still chained the minds and dreams of the poor. His message began to challenge not only individuals but systems, the unseen walls that kept people trapped in cycles of struggle. Many admired his courage, but even more feared his growing influence. The more he spoke about fairness for all, the more those in power began to see him as a threat to their control. He began visiting the poorest neighborhoods, speaking directly to those who had lost hope. He walked among them not as a celebrity, but as a brother. He listened to their stories, their pain, their hunger. He told them that dignity was not found in wealth, but in self-respect and unity. His presence brought light where darkness had settled for generations. He reminded people that poverty was not their identity, it was a test of their will. He wanted them to rise, to educate themselves, to work with faith and perseverance. He taught that the key to freedom was not waiting for someone to give it, but building it from within. Many of his closest advisors warned him that this new direction, talking about economic justice, would make powerful enemies. But he was never a man driven by comfort or fear. He believed that truth should never be selective. If he spoke against racial injustice, he had to speak against all forms of injustice. To him, silence in the face of suffering was betrayal. His speeches became bolder, his tone more direct. He began challenging not only local authorities, but also national systems that thrived on inequality. Every word he spoke was heavy with courage, and every truth came at a cost. His travels took him to different cities where he gathered workers, laborers, and families who had long been ignored. He spoke to them about unity, faith, and self-reliance. The same courage that stands against hate, he said, must also stand against hunger. His words inspired communities to organize, to support each other, to build strength in solidarity. He was teaching them that revolutions don't just happen in streets, they happen in minds. He wanted his people to believe in their worth, to understand that justice is not complete until everyone has a fair chance to live with dignity. But the more he pushed for equality in every area of life, the more resistance he faced. The media began to twist his message. Some called him divisive, others said he was overreaching, yet he kept going. His conviction was too deep to be shaken by opinion. He often said that the truth is not measured by how many people accept it, but by how pure it remains in the face of lies. His calm in the middle of criticism became legendary. Even when surrounded by false accusations, he never spoke with bitterness. His patience reflected his faith that justice delayed is never justice denied if one remains steadfast. The world began to notice his transformation. He was no longer just a leader of a movement. He was a moral force, a voice that transcended borders. He began to attract people from different faiths, colors, and nations who saw in him a reflection of humanity's higher purpose. They admired how he blended faith with action, humility with courage. To many, he represented what leadership should be, not ruling others, but serving them. His journey was proving that the truest power is not in domination, but in discipline and devotion to truth. Despite the heavy threats and constant pressure, his tone never became harsh. He continued to preach peace with even greater conviction. He would often remind his followers that the end goal was not to destroy their enemies, but to awaken their hearts. If we win the fight but lose our compassion, he said, then we have lost everything. That mindset kept his movement pure. It taught his people that moral victory is greater than material victory, and that peace is the ultimate form of strength. He started receiving invitations from all around the world, yet he remained grounded. Fame never blinded him. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a servant of truth. His humility became one of his greatest weapons. It disarmed critics and inspired followers. Even as the spotlight grew brighter, he continued to live simply, focusing on his mission rather than his image. He wanted his life to be a message that greatness is not found in what one gains, but in what one gives for a righteous cause. Everywhere he went, he reminded people that change begins from the inside. He told them that to rise as a nation, they must first rise as individuals through education, hard work, and moral integrity. His message was timeless, that no law or policy can give a person dignity if they refuse to claim it within themselves. His words planted seeds of hope in the hearts of millions, awakening a belief that the future can always be rewritten by those who choose faith over fear. Through his evolving mission, he had built not just a movement, but a mindset. He had shown that leadership is not about conquering others, but about conquering one's own ego. His new focus on justice for all people, regardless of race or class, elevated him from a national figure to a symbol of universal truth. He had become a king without a throne, leading a revolution without violence, commanding an army without weapons. And though many sought to silence him, the echo of his words had already become eternal, because when truth is spoken with faith, it outlives even the man who spoke it. The danger that had followed him for years began to grow closer, more tangible, more threatening than ever before. Letters of warning came, anonymous calls arrived, and whispers spread among his followers that his enemies were plotting something darker than intimidation. Yet he carried on as if nothing had changed. Fear had long lost its grip on him. He understood that when a person stands for truth, danger is not an accident, it is a companion. Every messenger of justice must walk through a valley of threats before reaching the mountain of legacy. To him, his life was not his own anymore. It belonged to the mission he had vowed to fulfill. Despite the growing risks, he continued to speak openly, publicly, and powerfully. The tone of his voice grew deeper, wiser, more reflective. He began to sound like a man who could see beyond the horizon of his own time. His words carried a strange calm, as if he knew something the world did not. When he spoke to crowds, they felt both inspired and uneasy. There was a quiet strength in him that no threat could shake, a faith so strong that it made danger seem powerless. His courage was not the absence of fear, it was the victory of purpose over fear. His followers, however, were worried. They begged him to take more precautions, to travel less, to stay safe. But he would only smile gently and remind them that protection comes from faith, not walls. "If I am to die," he once said softly, "I only pray it will be for something that still lives after me." That statement revealed everything about his mindset. He had already surrendered himself to destiny. For him, life's value was not in its length, but in its impact. He wanted to live a life that outlasted his breath. And in that, he had already achieved what few ever could. As he moved from city to city, his speeches began to feel almost prophetic. He spoke as though he was preparing his people for a world without him. He reminded them that movements should never depend on one man. "If my voice is silenced," he said, "let your heart speak louder." Those words were both powerful and painful to hear. His followers wept, sensing the truth behind his warnings. He was building not just a legacy, but a lineage of courage, a generation that would continue the struggle even if he was gone. He often spoke about the importance of faith in the face of fear. He said that a person who trusts in the Almighty has already defeated death, because no enemy can take what God has already written. His faith was not for display, it was his source of strength. In every challenge he found purpose, in every danger he found direction. He believed that trials were divine tests meant to refine, not destroy, those chosen for greatness. Even in his private moments when exhaustion pressed on his body, he remained spiritually calm, certain that his mission was part of a divine plan greater than himself. The threats around him turned into real attempts to break his spirit. His home was attacked, his family received threats, his reputation was attacked by lies, yet he remained composed. Every attack only proved to him that he was on the right path. The more they tried to destroy him, the more people began to see the truth he stood for. His patience in the face of hatred became his greatest sermon. He taught that sometimes the enemy is not a person, but the darkness that hides in hearts, and that light, when steady, eventually exposes and destroys that darkness. He began to speak more about sacrifice, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. If a seed refuses to fall, he said, it can never grow into a tree. His followers understood what he meant, though their hearts trembled. He was preparing them for the day he might no longer walk among them. Yet he wanted them to understand that truth cannot die, because it is not human, it is divine. His own life had become a living lesson, that even one man, armed with faith and patience, can ignite change that nations cannot stop. The more his enemies plotted against him, the more his message spread. It began to reach not just across America, but across oceans. His name was spoken with reverence in places he had never visited. People of different faiths, colors, and nations saw in him a reflection of the universal struggle between oppression and justice. He had become larger than a man, he was now a symbol, and symbols cannot be killed. They only grow stronger with time. In his final days, there was a strange peace around him. Those close to him said that he spoke often about destiny and contentment. He knew the risk, but he refused to hide. "I've been to the mountaintop," he declared in his last speech, "and I've seen the promised land." To his listeners, it was a metaphor, but to him it was a truth revealed. He had glimpsed the victory that would come, even if he did not live to see it. His eyes carried a light of acceptance, not of defeat, but of fulfillment. And so, as he walked toward the final chapter of his earthly journey, he carried no fear, no regret, only peace. He had fought not with weapons, but with words, not with hatred, but with hope. His enemies could end his life, but not his message. His dream, born of patience and faith, would continue to echo through generations. For he had proven that the most powerful empire a man can ever build is not made of land, wealth, or armies, but of hearts awakened by truth and united by justice. After his passing, the world seemed to pause, not in silence, but in awakening. The man who had walked with peace and spoken with fire had left behind a legacy that could not be buried. Across cities, nations, and generations, his words echoed with greater power than ever before. The very people who once feared his rise now found themselves humbled by his truth. His death did not end his mission, it magnified it. Where one man had stood, now millions stood together. His name became a call to conscience, and his message became a mirror reflecting humanity's struggle for righteousness. Crowds filled the streets to honor him, but more than grief, there was a fire of realization in their eyes. They began to understand that he was not just a leader, he was a lesson. His courage had proven that a single soul with unwavering faith can shake the foundation of oppression. The seeds he planted had taken root in the hearts of people who would never again bow to injustice. They began to march not in his memory, but in his spirit. He had turned ordinary men and women into carriers of his vision, warriors of peace armed with conviction instead of anger. His speeches were replayed, his writings studied, and his prayers remembered. Young people who had never seen him alive spoke of him as if they had walked beside him. His ideas began shaping classrooms, parliaments, and movements across the world. Governments that once opposed him now quoted his words. His image became more than a symbol. It became a reminder that true power lies in moral courage, not in crowns or thrones. The empire he built was invisible yet indestructible. It lived in hearts, not borders. Historians wrote of his greatness, but they could never capture his spirit fully, because his strength had never come from books, it came from faith. It came from that deep belief that truth, when spoken sincerely, can outlive any tyrant. His followers understood that his victory was not in surviving danger, but in transforming it. He had taken pain and turned it into purpose, threats and turned them into testimony. His legacy became a living example that patience and perseverance, when guided by faith, always triumph over hatred. As years passed, his message began to evolve beyond the context of his time. It became universal. Every oppressed soul, every voice silenced by fear, every person standing alone against injustice could hear his voice whisper, "Keep going, you are not alone." His story crossed languages, borders, and beliefs, because truth does not belong to one people. It belongs to all humanity. He had taught that justice is not a privilege, it is a divine right, and standing for it is an act of worship, not rebellion. Generations later, children studied his life not as history but as inspiration. Teachers spoke of him not just as a man of courage, but as a man of divine purpose. In homes, parents told their children that the measure of greatness is not in wealth, but in service. In mosques, churches, and synagogues, people prayed for the strength to stand as he did, with humility, with faith, and with unshakable resolve. His dream had outlived his life because it had been rooted in moral truth, not worldly ambition. The world changed in ways he might never have imagined. Laws shifted, societies awakened, and even those who had once opposed him came to honor his name. His enemies, long gone, were forgotten, but his message continued to rise. It became the foundation of movements for equality, the inspiration for speeches on peace, and the spark for revolutions of the heart. His victory was not in conquest, but in conviction. He had shown that you can conquer the world without taking a single life, simply by awakening it. Even today, his words still ring with timeless relevance. Whenever injustice rises, people remember him. Whenever fear spreads, his courage becomes the cure. His life became a blueprint for all who dream of change. He showed that the truest form of leadership is not authority but servitude, serving people with love, guiding them with wisdom, and protecting them with truth. His empire was not built on soil but on souls, and that is why it can never fall. The beauty of his legacy lies in its purity. He sought no fame, no title, no earthly reward. He simply wanted a world where dignity belonged to every human being. And that sincerity is why his message will never fade. Time can erase monuments, but not truth. Kingdoms crumble, but character endures. He had built his reign not through power, but through principle, and that made his name immortal. In the end, the world realized that the man they had once called a rebel was, in truth, a reformer. His war had never been against people. It had been against injustice itself. He had fought not with hatred but with hope, not for himself but for everyone. And through that, he achieved the greatest victory of all. He transformed the hearts of men. His empire was one of light, a kingdom not of land but of love, where justice reigns eternal, and his legacy continues to remind us that truth, once awakened, can never die. As Martin Luther King Jr. reached the height of his movement, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders became heavier than ever before. The world looked to him not just as a leader but as a symbol of hope, and that expectation tested his patience, faith, and strength in ways few could imagine. Every decision he made carried the burden of millions who believed in his dream. He could no longer think of himself as an individual. He had become the voice of a generation. The world watched his every step. Critics waited for him to stumble, and yet he stood firm, grounded not in pride but in purpose. He reminded himself daily that this journey was not about recognition, but redemption for a nation that had lost its sense of justice and equality. He spent countless nights awake, praying for guidance. The threats on his life increased, the pressure intensified, and yet his resolve never broke. There were moments when fear whispered that perhaps the fight was too great, but his faith silenced those doubts. He believed that courage is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. And so, even when he felt the weight of despair pressing against his heart, he rose each morning with renewed strength. He preached peace even when hatred surrounded him, love even when anger burned through the streets. His leadership became a test of faith, not just in his message, but in his Creator's plan. Behind every public speech were hours of personal struggle. He wrestled with exhaustion, with loneliness, with the pain of seeing innocent people suffer for standing beside him. Yet he refused to let that pain define him. Instead, he turned it into purpose. Every time someone was jailed, he spoke louder. Every time someone was beaten, he marched farther. He knew that every act of cruelty only revealed how much the world needed healing, and he was determined to be that healer. His resilience became the mirror through which people saw their own strength. There came a time when even his closest allies began to waver. Some questioned his path of peace, urging him to respond to violence with force. But he stood firm, knowing that to fight hate with hate would only destroy the very dream he had built. He told them that light can never come from darkness, that one must rise above pain to transform it. His calmness in chaos, his humility in leadership, and his gentleness in power became his greatest weapons. He was not just changing laws, he was changing hearts, and that, he knew, was the only way to create lasting freedom. The challenges grew fiercer as the movement gained momentum. Governments resisted, institutions clung to old systems, and enemies plotted his downfall. Yet, every setback only deepened his faith. He began to see that struggles are not signs of failure, but signs of progress. For the higher one climbs, the stronger the wind blows. He understood that every test was preparing him for something greater. His words during these times were filled with divine conviction, that truth, no matter how long suppressed, will always rise again. In private moments, he often reflected on the cost of his calling. He missed time with his family, moments of peace that others took for granted. But he accepted that sacrifice as part of his duty. He reminded himself that prophets of old had walked paths even harder, and their endurance had shaped the world. That thought gave him peace. He knew he was part of something far bigger than himself, a mission that stretched beyond life, beyond generations. His strength was not his own. It was drawn from the timeless truth that when one stands for justice, the Creator stands with him. Despite all obstacles, his influence continued to expand. Cities that once silenced him now listened. People who once opposed him began to question their own beliefs. He had not forced change, he had inspired it. That was his genius. He transformed enemies into witnesses, critics into learners, and followers into leaders. His voice reached beyond borders, reminding the world that justice anywhere strengthens humanity everywhere. He proved that power guided by righteousness will always outlast power guided by fear. There were days when he sensed that his mission was nearing its end, though he never spoke of it openly. He could feel it in the way the world trembled around him, as if history itself was preparing for a great turning point. But he did not fear what was coming. Instead, he became more fearless, more focused, more at peace. His faith in Allah's will gave him serenity that no threat could shake. He often said that one should not seek a long life, but a purposeful one, and his life was overflowing with purpose. The people around him noticed a glow in his presence, a calmness that seemed almost otherworldly. He no longer spoke only of civil rights. He spoke of the soul of humanity. He warned that true victory would not come through policy, but through purification of hearts. He was preparing people not just for freedom, but for moral awakening. His message was timeless, that the greatest revolution is not fought on battlefields, but within ourselves. As his final days approached, his voice grew even more powerful. He began to speak as if he could already see the horizon of victory. He told his followers that though the path ahead was still long, they were closer than ever to the promise of equality. He urged them not to give up, for light was rising beyond the mountains of hardship, and though he would not walk that path forever, he made sure the world knew that his dream, the dream of justice, peace, and divine truth, would never die, because it had been written not in speeches, but in the hearts of those who believed. The day came when the voice that had shaken nations was silenced, but his message echoed louder than ever before. Martin Luther King Jr. left the world not in defeat, but in eternal triumph. The moment his life was taken, something powerful happened. The world did not fall into despair. It rose with purpose. People who had once been afraid now stood taller. They realized that while a man could be silenced, an idea rooted in truth could never die. His departure became a spark that ignited millions of hearts to continue what he had begun. His legacy was no longer just his, it belonged to humanity. News of his martyrdom spread like wildfire, streets filled with tears, but not the tears of weakness. They were tears of awakening. The pain united people more than his speeches ever could. Those who once opposed him began to see the purity of his mission. They realized that his strength had come not from anger, but from a love for justice that transcended worldly desires. His followers, though broken-hearted, found new courage in his memory. They knew that he had not failed. He had completed his divine assignment. He had become immortal through the impact he left behind. In the days that followed, his dream became the foundation of a new movement. People began to live the principles he had preached: forgiveness, patience, unity, and steadfastness in the face of evil. His image became a symbol of moral leadership, a reminder that one man's truth can stand against the lies of an empire. The world began to reflect on the meaning of justice and the power of peaceful resistance. Nations that had ignored the cries of the oppressed could no longer look away. He had not just changed a country, he had changed the conscience of humanity. Even those in power who had once mocked or opposed him began to honor his name. Schools, streets, and monuments were built to preserve his memory, but his true monument was not made of stone. It was built in the hearts of people who refused to bow to hatred. Every time someone stood up for what was right without violence, every time a person forgave instead of retaliating, his spirit lived again. His teachings became a light guiding future generations through the darkness of prejudice and division. Years passed, but the power of his message never faded. Children grew up learning his words and dreaming his dream. He had become more than a leader, he had become a lesson. His story was told in every language, in every nation, proving that justice has no borders and truth has no color. What made his legacy eternal was not his fame, but his faith, his unshakable belief that right will always overcome wrong. His dream was no longer a hope. It had become a reality that people continued to build upon with every act of kindness and courage. His influence began to shape world leaders, thinkers, and reformers. They quoted his words, followed his example, and applied his methods to their own struggles. The path he walked, one of peace, patience, and principle, became the standard for every moral revolution that came after him. He had shown that victory does not come from destroying enemies, but from transforming them. Through his life, the world learned that the most powerful kind of rule is the rule over one's own anger and ego. His family, though burdened by grief, carried his mission with grace. They became living examples of his teachings, choosing forgiveness over bitterness, perseverance over despair. Their strength inspired millions, showing that even after loss, faith can rebuild what seems broken. They knew that Martin's work had not ended, it had only changed form. Through them, and through every person touched by his words, the flame of justice continued to burn. His story became not a tale of tragedy, but of triumph through faith and fortitude. Generations later, his name still echoes in every discussion of equality and human dignity. His speeches are studied, his marches remembered, his courage celebrated. But those who truly understand him know that his greatness was not in what he achieved, but in how he achieved it through patience, sincerity, and unyielding trust in divine justice. His success was not measured by the laws he changed, but by the hearts he awakened. He proved that the greatest revolutions begin in silence, in prayer, and in conviction that truth cannot be defeated. Today, his story stands as a reminder that the struggle for justice is never over. Each generation must carry the torch forward, fighting ignorance with knowledge and hatred with compassion. His life calls on every human being to be a voice of fairness in their own sphere, to stand firm even when standing alone. The war he fought was not against people, but against the darkness within humanity, and that battle continues. But now the world fights it armed with the wisdom he left behind. And so the king who never wore a crown became a legend who ruled over the hearts of millions. His empire was not built on land or wealth, but on conscience and courage. His dream became the blueprint for humanity's higher purpose, to rise above division and live by justice. Though his life was cut short, his influence remains endless. He proved that a true king does not conquer through force, but through faith, that the greatest victory is not over nations, but over the self. And in that victory, Martin Luther King Jr. became eternal, the King of Justice forever. He did not leave behind a throne or a crown. He left behind a legacy that still guides generations. His empire was built on forgiveness, his weapon was truth, and his power was faith. And though his voice was silenced, his echo still moves the hearts of the brave. He proved that justice may be delayed, but it can never be destroyed. The King of Justice lives on, not in the pages of history, but in every soul that dares to stand for what's right. Because heroes never die, they simply rise again in the hearts of those who continue their fight.